Welcome to the Venari podcast. My name is Ben Brickell. Today, I'm joined by Jose Gomez, who's a gene therapy commercialization expert. We're going to talk about the future of gene therapy and some of the challenges associated with access and reimbursement in particular. So, Jose, great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Ben. Great chatting with you today.
Yeah, did you want to give a quick introduction from your side?
Sure. My name is Jose Gomez. I've been in the biotech and pharma industry for 28 years. The last 12 years, I've been focused on rare diseases. And in fact, the last 6 years, focused on gene therapy, both in vivo and ex vivo approaches.
Yeah, cool. Good. So how did you first get into working with gene therapies, and what was it that attracted you to the science?
Great question. I actually began seriously thinking about gene therapies from a commercial perspective as early as 2011, while I was working at Shire HGT, Human Genetic Therapies. That was the former genetic rare diseases business unit at Shire, which is, of course, now Takeda. However, I formally began working in the gene therapy space in 2017 when I joined AveXis, now Novartis Gene Therapies. At AveXis, I had the opportunity to work on Zolgensma, a transformative AAV-based one-time gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. I led the development of the global access and value strategy for Zolgensma, among other things. In fact, I actually remained at AveXis post the Novartis acquisition until 2020 when I joined Avrobio. Avrobio is a lentiviral-based clinical stage gene therapy company that is focused on developing therapies for lysosomal storage disorders. And I joined Avrobio as Senior Vice President of Access and Value, and also was the global commercial leader for the Pompe and cystinosis gene therapy programs.
You sort of recently stepped away from Avrobio. What's next for you, Jose?
I am currently assessing opportunities to determine the right next step for me professionally. Where can I contribute the most, given my skill set, my experience, etc., but also where the science can have the most impact on patients. That to me is the guiding post, right? So I have a huge passion to bring to markets globally therapies that address the root cause of the disease. And that could be whether it's gene therapy, gene editing, or other novel therapeutic approaches. Instead of just treating the symptoms, right? Historically, what you see in the market are therapies that just treat patients chronically for life. And I see that as the greatest opportunities to transform healthcare globally. So moving away from, what I call activity-based healthcare, treating patients chronically sick for life, to therapies that have the potential to halt, reverse, or even potentially cure certain genetic diseases. And this is the path where I see my career continuing.
Cool, great, thank you. And I know your background has obviously coming from some of the larger pharmaceutical companies, and then moving into a lot of the gene therapies coming from the earlier stage biotech companies. Seen a lot of people making that transition from Big Pharma into smaller biotech. How did you find that transition? And then also, quite interestingly, coming into a company like AveXis and then being acquired by Novartis, so kind of going from Big Pharma to biotech, then back into Big Pharma again. How do you find these transitions?
Frankly, I found the transition to be quite easy. I think in general, large organizations are far better resourced, of course, and the infrastructure is already available, right? It's sitting there for optimization. However, when it comes to kind of the aspects of larger pharma, slower decision making and the roles tend to be a bit more structured, right? In some cases, I would argue even a bit siloed. In comparison, small biotech is in general highly unstructured. That can be a plus or a negative. But by default, you end up doing things beyond kind of the traditional scope of your job description, right? So, which for some individuals that will be desirable, and in some cases is not appealing. For me, it was extremely appealing. There's obviously more, faster decision making. The biggest downside, in my opinion, of small biotech is, of course, that resources are limited, and ensuring that you have adequate funding, particularly in a pre-commercial biotech, is always top of mind. This is becoming very evident these days. As you can see, overall biotech valuations have dropped considerably. So raising capital via equity, et cetera, is highly diluted, making it more expensive. So, smaller organizations, you have to worry about some things that in a larger organization, you don't have to really worry about.
I know you have the advantage of having worked in both the US and Europe, and we've seen some gene therapy manufacturers opt out of Europe recently. The question is the reimbursement that much easier in the US, or rather that much harder in Europe? How do you see that?
So I'll give you the short answer first. And the short answer is that in general, the healthcare systems in Europe and for that matter, anywhere outside of the US, generally do tend to be more centralized, of course, and with very well-established resources, right? And that in general leads to the perception, which I believe is accurate, that in the US, it's perhaps easier to gain reimbursement. For example, the use of health technology assessments, HTA for short, is very prevalent, as you know, outside of the US, right? And the influence that these HTAs have in Europe is very significant in ultimately determining the access and the reimbursement of new products. In the US, the implementation of HTA has been gaining some traction over the past few years. However, historically, Europe has been well ahead of the US in the widespread implementation and use of health technology assessments. So I think that's a very significant factor. Now, all of this to say that Europe is not a lost cause for gene therapy, and I want to make that very clear. There are very good examples out there where you can see gene therapies that have been very successful in achieving reimbursement and access in Europe and beyond, for instance, Luxturna and Zolgensma. However, at the end of the day, the burden of proof on establishing the incremental value of these new therapies lies on the manufacturers. So it is really, really critical for manufacturers to begin value evidence planning in the very early stage of clinical development. So for example, in gene therapy, as early as phase 1-2, so that you ensure that adequate evidence is available at product launch to substantiate the value of your new product.
Obviously, undoubtedly, the patient responses you're seeing, some of these gene therapies coming through is phenomenal. So hopefully, we can get past these challenges. But geography aside, I mean, there are a whole host of other challenges that gene therapy manufacturers are facing. How do we sort of overcome some of those, and how do you see the future of gene therapy?
Let's start with the science, right? So there has been some setbacks in the gene therapy space over the past few years. We've seen some clinical holds, et cetera, both for AAV as well as for lenti ex vivo approaches. So in some cases, it's an emerging safety or toxicity signal. In other cases, we have seen some waning of durability of effect. And in other cases, perhaps some safety dosing considerations. What we're seeing in the market is several AAV gene therapy companies out there are pivoting to next generation AAV capsids. So, and in fact, even non-viral vectors to achieve a more targeted efficacy, increased tissue tropism, and improve the long-term durability of effect while also reducing toxicity. Ultimately, I do believe that the science, while it's still evolving and will continue to evolve, no doubt, will ultimately succeed in determining what is the right therapeutic approach for a given genetic disease. I think ultimately the science will prevail, and we will see gene therapy coming very strongly. I also believe let's say from a healthcare system perspective, and starting to think more about reimbursement, et cetera, the healthcare systems around the world will eventually evolve and accommodate for novel reimbursement pathways to make these truly transformative therapies accessible to patients. So particularly as more of these therapies make it to market, there's going to be a point in time where payers, HTAs, and other key stakeholders will adapt, right, and make these new therapies available faster, more broadly, et cetera. But that will require very strong partnerships and adjustments by all the key stakeholders. So when I say that, I mean, starting with payers and HTAs, certainly manufacturers, regulators, and other policymakers.
Yeah, certainly agree. It's going to be a combined approach of those things. So I look forward to seeing that play out. Jose, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk.